God morgon. Good morning. It's my Swedish. I'm going to talk for a while, but I would like you to interrupt if try and catch my eye if you want to ask a question or if you want to make a point. So it's quite a big group, so it'll be an interact. I'll try and make it interactive, and there is an activity at the end. But I've got some things to say, so that's why I have a will to voice. So, first of all, why I'm talking about this? Well, I came to life stories or narratives, or what I call auto/biography, through being a researcher. First of all, through my own work, and when I wrote a book in the 90s, I felt that I had to explain who I was, that the ideas in the book weren't just dragged out of nowhere. They actually had a bodily person at their origins, and so I had to explain who I was. So I wrote a chapter on autobiography, and I remember shaping it. I was quite conscious of Kirk's presentation about himself, because when I wrote my chapter, I wrote it and rewrote it and wrote it, and I got up in the middle of the night and changed the words. And of course it was such an act of self-representation. So it made me think, well, what am I doing here? What is this act when I'm doing autobiography? I also have realised that an awful lot of what we do in educational research is biography or autobiography. That is, that we ask people to tell their stories, and then we often, as researchers, we retell their stories. So one is autobiography and one is biography. So we do a lot of it anyway. And I've also, my PhD wasn't in education actually, it was in history, and I did a PhD about a feminist, I think I've told you this, a feminist activist in the 19th century called Harriet Martineau. Now she wrote an autobiography, and then over the years there have been biographies in terms of articles or in terms of books or evaluations of her life written by a lot of other people, and they're all different. And I thought, and there were a lot of them when I was starting my PhD, and I thought, well, what is this act of, first of all, autobiography, and then what is this act of writing about somebody else's life? And what I found was that there was such a lot of ideology embedded in the way we tell stories. So it depends on our perspective what kind of stories we tell, whether it is our own story or somebody else's story. And finally, to say that I'm hugely critical, I'm very committed to this kind of research. But what I want to do today is make you very critical about it as well. And my idea here is mainly based, my idea for this talk is mainly going to concentrate on interpretation, how we understand the stories that people tell us or people write about us. And I'm going to tell you a joke now. And I'm not very good at telling jokes, so I'm going to read it. But it does have relevance. An elderly Jewish man is walking down the street in Brighton. He's slowly trying to cross the road when a bus comes towards him. He leaps back and slips and loses his balance and finds himself lying on the ground. A passerby quickly rushes to his aid and uses her jacket to cushion his head until the ambulance arrives. "Are you okay?" she says. "Are you comfortable?" she asks. He replies, "I mustn't grumble, I'll make a living." Now do you No laughed. Now, this is a particular joke, and it's all about interpretation. I'll explain if you didn't understand. Which is that the passerby, the woman, and this is saying to the old man, are you feeling comfortable? You're lying on your, you're being injured. And when he interprets being uncomfortable, comfortable as being prosperous, I make a living. Right? And the hands show that, right? So this illustrates, in fact, the point of the joke, which for some of you wasn't a joke, which is that it's all about interpretation. So this might, some of you thought, what's this funny story about some Jewish person? Now, first of all, some of you didn't get the joke. Secondly, if I'd have said Stockholm or Manhattan, or what would you have responded in a different way? I have a Jewish background, right? So does my background make it better or worse in terms of telling this joke? Does where you come from, does your background make it easier or not to understand the joke? And some of you from Middle Eastern countries might have a very different take on it, because I'm offering a Jewish perspective, if you like. So, and one of the interesting things, by the way, I found in my discourse in Britain is, if you say Jew in some British company, people get very uncomfortable. They get very uncomfortable, and there's quite a lot of work on this anyway. But so I'm using this really deliberately, this joke and my positioning, because I think it's important to make people uncomfortable to some extent, but also illustrates a lot of what I'm going to say in a minute. Just also to say, before I start, that my current work that informs an awful lot of this is I'm doing research on my family. I'm a second generation immigrant. My parents were refugees in the war from National Socialism, and I'm writing their 3 lives. I think I did present this in Stirling, but nobody was in Stirling. I'm writing about my grandmother, who started off in a shtetl town, a Jewish town in Ukraine, in the turn of the century, and moved to Vienna, where she spent 40 years raising a family and becoming prosperous and westernized. And then at the end of her life, she was deported and died in Treblinka. That's a terribly sad story, one of many similar stories. My father was a Polish refugee who worked in Belgium as a coal miner, so I'm a coal miner's daughter. And then he was a communist, and he was Jewish, and he was thrown out of Belgium in 1938, and his statements, he had nowhere to go. He tried to stow away to Canada, and he ended up illegally in London. My mother and the British wanted to deport him, but the war started before they could deport him. And my mother was a refugee from Vienna who came to London legally as a refugee just before the war started. She met my father while he was in London, and I was born towards the end of the war, and then he was deported immediately afterwards, so I was brought up by her. But the interesting thing is, when she applied for naturalisation, that's citizenship, it was denied on the basis of her relationship with my father, who was a communist. So those are the 3 stories, and I'm not going to go into them any further. Well, you're going to see something, but not a lot about them. But why I've been telling them is that this is about ordinary people. These 3 people were 20th century people. They lived in the 20th century, and they were affected by the movements in the 20th century that my father became a communist, I expect, after the Russian Revolution and the rise of the communists. They were affected by the rise of National Socialism and fascism, and then they were affected by the Cold War. So they are very, so one of the reasons I'm writing about them is they show the impact of these big movements on individual people. But I also, and this is my effective start, I'm writing them as an act of restitution. I want them to be visible and not just numbers in the people who, I say my grandmother among the people who died. So that's the basis of this talk. So let's go through it. Right. Now I'm going to talk to you very briefly about what to do. But the interest I have is in autobiography as a research method. I mean, we know that autobiography biography is very, very popular. All the books, all the popular bookstores have got biographies and autobiographies. It's very popular. We love reading biographies and autobiographies. But this is really about how we use this rich narrative in research for research. So how useful is it as a research method? What are its strengths and what are its weaknesses? Now, I just felt I had to put this in because of the title, because it said, what is in a story? And I felt I should put this in, but the presentation is not really about this. But the kind of sources for biographical work is documentary evidence. For instance, a lot of the information I got on my father is in his file. He had a file on him in Belgium. So I have a life in documents of him. So it's not only what people say, but it's how other people write up a life. So, and you have to have access, and you have to be able to take these documents away, or you have to be able to, I got the whole file scanned, and so I have it digitally. Now, interviews. Now, I mean, you said that I was very interested in interviewing at one time, and the interest I had, and this was when I was at the Open University, was that so much of the equipment didn't work when you started an interview. So when you did a workshop on how to interview with graduate students, when they started off, but half the time the main problem was that equipment didn't work, and so they didn't get their interview. Well, nowadays, as somebody in my group said, you interview with your phone. Mm-hmm. So those kind of problems are not there, but it's still important that you get your equipment is working if you're doing an interview. But then you've got, you've got access, and you've got to transcribe, and the ethics around whether you show the interviewees your interview, your work on that. Diaries, memoirs, memorabilia. Again, they're similar to documented evidence. You need access, and you need the ability to copy or scan. And I've put these other things at the bottom because they've been very useful to me. It's very important when you're looking at people's lives that you look at similar studies, that you have other kinds of comparisons to make, so that you. Because sometimes you don't you're only using one or two, you're only interviewing a small number of people. So I think other studies are very important. And then there's a wider literature review and access to journals, libraries, and the internet. Now, all of that probably is nothing new to you. But I felt I should say that because the talk was titled What You Should Do. But now it's interpretation. Now, yes, let me just describe what I mean by autobiography. And it's a history of a particular life written by the self. Now, it doesn't have to be a whole life, it can be an aspect of a life, and it can be experience, but it's written by the self, and there's a complex interplay between the present and past, life reviewed at specific stages, so that, you have a kind of order in your story. The subject has ownership of voice and text, and the act of autobiography is in the present. So you're telling the story now, but often you're looking back, and so there are issues there. And those are the kind of sources at the bottom of autobiography that some of you will be be involved in at the moment. And I'm telling you this because people don't know the distinction, and so I want to make it very clear at the beginning. Biography is a history of a particular life written by another. And we do a lot of that as researchers. We listen to what our interviewees say, and then we either use quotations, select quotations, we represent their lives, or we extract themes out of their lives. So it is written by another. Usually it has a narrative structure. The act of biography is in the present, but the influence of the writer, the influence of the biographer, is paramount. So that you get a change in power relationships between those two forms. But it's very similar kind of sources of biography. Is anybody into? Yeah.
I was just wondering about memoirs.
Memoirs. Well, memoirs are. You see, they can be a wide range of things. Memoirs tend to be a kind of autobiographical account, but loosely written can be very personal. It can be a very personal memoir of a life or a particular part of the life, so it tends to be more personal. Wouldn't you say that, memoirs? Now, I've been very interested in collective biography, which is called prosopography, and it's a Bourdieuian concept, and it took me a long time to say prosopography. And it's a very interesting methodology developed by Pierre Bourdieu, but also taken up in Sweden by Donald Brody in Uppsala, who's done quite a lot of work on this. And it's a study of, and what it is a collection of data, autobiographical and biographical data, of individuals in a field. Same collection of data on each of these people. So each of this collection of data constitutes a life, or a particular part of the life. And yet, but the idea is to collect a lot of examples of this data, and in that work you are illuminating the field rather than the individual. So it's not about the individual, but it's what personal stories can contribute to a field. And Inga Eriksson Arman, who a lot of you know, she did I think a very good prosopography on teacher educators in Umeå, and collected detailed data of about 50 or 60 teacher educators, and got a lovely story about the growth of the field of teacher education in Umeå. So the same set of data is collected for each individual, and the main focus is on the history and structure of the field, and not the individual. I don't know how many of you are doing multiple, have you got larger numbers of subjects, larger number of interviewees, but I do encourage this form of analysis, this form of collection, and this form of research, because you bridge the qualitative quantity dualism in this kind of research, and it's quite interesting. And then I just want to, before I go really into depth, I want to talk about what makes narrative into scholarship. And there's a very good book by Ivor Goodson and Pat Sykes, who really go into depth about how to write stories, how to report on stories. And they say what makes narrative into life history is a second layer and further interpretation, usually by a scholarly other, which is the researcher. That's the first layer is more autobiographical, and the second is biographical. And as I've said to you, once the researcher comes in, it's the researcher's voice then becomes, unless they're extremely skilled, it's the author's voice, it's the biographer's voice that is paramount, it's the researcher's voice. And these are the kinds of autobiographical forms. And there's the genre, and I've put in blue those that you might be doing now, or those that you might characterise your work as. So there's a lot of historical biographies and autobiographies, literary, they're very popular. Virginia Woolf, you know, the latest on Virginia Woolf, or many kind of very scholarly work. Political, we have a lot of biographies currently of Margaret Thatcher that seem to, because she died recently. Military, about generals and about, you know, army leaders. And then we have educational. There are very few what are termed autobiographies in education in Britain. And there's one, there's one historian of education called Brian Simon, wrote autobiography about his life, but he left out as much as he left in. So it wasn't really much of a autobiography. So sometimes they don't illuminate much of a life. You can actually write a book without revealing anything about yourself if you want to hide yourself. So there are issues around writing autobiography. And then you've got what I call the type, the popular one. You've got the celebrities, the pop singers, the latest boy band. You've got what they call pathography, which is the digging in the dirt. The nasty stuff. A lot of misery do you have this in Sweden? They call it in Britain misery memoirs, that people talking about how dreadful their life was and how they've overcome it. And then scholarly is where you provide evidence for what you're saying, basically. A scholarly, the type is that you provide evidence. You just can't make these statements. You have to provide evidence. And I'm trying to write in my own work a less scholarly kind. I want to write it more popularly, but I can't get myself out of footnotes, references, because I feel that nobody will believe me unless I say where I've got my evidence from. So it's quite difficult to move out of scholarship into popular biography. And I think Miriam David, who was here on the first day, she's writing these two stories about feminism. One, history of feminism. One is scholarly, and the other one is going to be much more popular. And then there's the political, the critiques. And again, I'm going to bring Margaret Thatcher in here, because, there's critical biographies that you can write which critique a particular person, right? And then there's the focus. And mostly biographies about famous people, about celebrities, villains, freaks. There are many biographies about royalty, and maybe in Sweden too, and about also the great key historical actors, the great white men and women, tend to be men, but some women in Britain. But what I'm particularly interested in is ordinary people, or hitherto invisible people. And the thing to say is, as soon as you write, which is why I'm writing this, as soon as you write about somebody, they cease to be invisible. And I think a lot of the kind of work that I'm doing is about this, as I said, this act of restitution, making these ordinary people who they were poor, my family were poor, they had no power, they tended to be, blown across Europe by the movements. And you get this feeling that they had agency too, but they had ignored the movements, social movements, had a terrific impact on their lives. Now, so why is this kind of work now of interest? And I would argue that it's more interesting, people writing this kind of thing more now than ever. And you'll be very familiar, I'm not going to go through this, you'll be very familiar with these arguments, because they're arguments about qualitative research, they're arguments about constructions, ideas. But the particular thing that I'm interested in my work is the bottom one. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between individuals and society. And, to what extent, how in the body, in the individual body, in the individual psyche, in the individual life pattern, can you see the impact of structures that sociologists talk about. So, and I think that this is why this kind of work is so interesting, because you can actually, otherwise it's just a story, otherwise it's, it's just an entertaining story. And that's the fascinating thing for me. Now, interpretation, and I love this quote. This is Billie Holiday's autobiography. She opens with, which is a lovely opening, isn't it? It grips you. But, in fact, they never married. Her parents never married. Her father was younger than her mother. She didn't even live in Baltimore. I mean, she wasn't born in Baltimore, but in Philadelphia. And you wonder, was it the ghostwriter who made it up, or was it Billie Holiday? And why? It's kind of interesting. But what you realise, as I have read through many biographies, many interviews, so-called research interviews, how people lie. They lie in all sorts of ways. They don't lie because they want to give you what you want. They lie because they want to hide things. They lie. They want to represent themselves well. They want to show themselves in the best light. They want to show themselves as very ethical. So, one of the key points of this presentation is, and it's difficult for you to some extent because you want your subjects, you want the people you're interviewing to give you data that's valuable, but you must be very suspicious. You must be very suspicious. And that's where you need to look at what other people are saying at the same time. And I'm going to give you a couple of slides, and these are just entertaining really, about what people have said about writing of lives. This tends to be the more literary kind of. So this is Julian Barnes, who's quite a well-known writer in Britain, and he's written a very interesting recent autobiography about the death of his wife. Very, very powerful. And he says, how often do we tell our life story? How often do we adjust it, embellish it, make sly cuts? And the longer a life goes on, of course, people don't know about the beginning, so you can totally reinvent yourself if you want to. And what he says is that we tell the story to ourselves. And a number of presentations here have talked about researchers' autobiography, that we research ourselves in the kind of questions we're asking of others. And so I think it's a very interesting comment. I like this. This is Quentin Crisp, who was what was he? It was a cross-dresser, kind of very famous guy. He's in the 80s and 90s, very famous. An autobiography is an obituary in serial form with the last instalment missing. And Carlyle, who's a famous historian of the 19th century, he argues that a well-written life is almost as rare as a well-spent one. It means, basically people don't write these things very, very well. And in the 19th century, there was an argument that biography was history, that history was, you could only do history through lives, that was what true history was. And you've got these three very well-known British, English, Ralph Waldo Emerson was American. At the same time, they're writing about, Benjamin Disraeli was a prime minister, but he was also an author. And he says that they say that biography, that the biography is the only history. But of course they were all great men, and they were making history, so they were actually reflecting on their own importance. And I've included a couple of extracts that I love. I love. Now this is an extract, it's a long one, by Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote a fascinating autobiography about the 20th century. Now he's a Marxist historian. Has anybody heard of him? Yeah. And he wrote, I think it's quite embarrassed. He didn't want to write this autobiography. I don't know why he wrote it, but he decided he would write it. And he reflects on what he is in writing this. I'll give you time to read it. And he was a refugee himself. He came over from Vienna in the 30s to escape what was happening there. And I just think it's very moving. I mean, I think he was a great writer and a very good analyst. And in that he weaves in what autobiographies are usually about, what he's trying to do, where his position is in society, and he's very modest. In fact, he's very well known, and he would be featured very much in some disciplines. And then he puts in the loss of his parents' invisibility. So in that paragraph on writing about why he did what he did, he weaves a story in that paragraph, and I think it's just hugely skilled. And this is another piece by somebody called Alan Bennett, who started off as a stand-up comedian, that is a literary figure in Britain. And he wrote this, and he wrote this about his mother. And I'll let you read it. And one of the things that autobiography can do, and this is a wonderful, excellent example, it can provide enormous insights. But fiction can do that too, and he writes a lot of his autobiography as fiction. So you see a lot of parallels between, but this is an actual autobiography rather than a fiction. And now we have pictures, and I was really pleased with John. I'm following on from John. Pictures are autobiography, and I've used my own pictures because of copyright, because all the problems you have with copyright, but also maybe because I want to show you. Mm-hmm. So there's a very difficult, there's a lot of it's very psychological doing this kind of work. And I want to show you the power of photographs. And photographs is biography, but they're autobiography. They are autobiographical photos because they're of me, but they're also biography. And what they can show is my life. And by the way, we've heard about selfies. This is a selfie. I thought I'd put it in, but the interesting thing about the selfie and the interesting thing about photographs and the interesting thing about autobiography is that these are very carefully chosen by me. Now, I took a lot of those selfies before I found one that I could tolerate. I love this picture. But I don't think I ever looked at it. It was taken and it was just, this was me in the 60s. No, it was me in the 80s. But I don't think I ever looked like that, but I put it there because it's the best photograph of me at that time. This photograph, I actually put in a book, which I'll tell you about in a minute. This photograph was taken when I was 60. in a party in Sweden, and it was very informal, and I wanted to use that because I wanted to move away from the photograph of somebody at 60 as old or inactive or respectable. I wanted to show somebody who enjoyed themselves. And in fact, it's quite interesting because I wrote this book, a lot of this is based on this book, and I wrote this book with an American, and her picture of her in the 60s is a very formal portrait. So I think it's very interesting the kind of self we want to represent in pictures. These are I like these. These are, there's a lot of these kind of pictures of people who are in the late 40s, early 50s. And I love this, you know, the socks and the lace-up shoes that we had, and we wore pinafore dresses to keep our clothes clean. And the kind of rolled up, which is fashionable now actually, again, the rolled up hair. So what I think about this is I think that this does give maybe as much insight into my life as anything I write. Or not. I mean, would anybody like to say anything? Or should I go on? Okay. Now this is another set of pictures. And this is my father. And do you remember I told you about a file I found in Belgium? And these are photographs I never had seen before. I did know my father, but not terribly well, because of the story. And these are, you know, what they call passport kind of photographs that he had to put on every application for visas, for movement around, so they are fit. You still have to have these photographs even now. So these are all of these photographs, and this is when he came in, he was the miner there, came into work in Belgium, and he was an amateur actor, and that's where he met his, I didn't tell you, there's a first family in Belgium. This is where he met his first family, and look at him there. And he looks so sort of actorish, doesn't he? He was a coal miner. And this looks more like a coal miner, I think, because of the scarf and the... But this looks like an act to me. And I wonder why he took it, how he took it, how it was it part of his, when he was in production, or was that part of his publicity photo? I don't know. And this is him when he's had his children by then, he was married. Now, the interesting thing about my father is he came into Poland, to Belgium from Poland, under an assumed name. And I use these, and so he comes in because, another part of the story, he is evading conscription. He's left Poland because he will be recruited into the army. And the reason that he doesn't want to go into the army is Poland is fighting the Soviet Union. He is a communist. He doesn't want to fight the Soviet Union. He's also Jewish, and the Soviet military, and the Polish military is very anti-Semitic. So he flees, he runs. And he runs west. He could have gone to the Soviet Union, actually. He runs west, and I don't know why he's run west. But he comes in under an assumed name, presumably because he doesn't want to be picked up by the Polish authorities. He has his own name there, and I looked at all these because I wanted to see if they were the same person, because they're different names. Do you think that's the same person as those three? And I think it is because of the hairline as much as anything. But so this is a bit. Then this is him when he met my mother in the 40s, and it's the only non-passport, and this is a non-passport. These are two, and you see a man growing up and growing old, and this is, and he came illegally into Britain to my wedding, and this is him at my wedding, first wedding. So, tells a story. A very powerful story, and I've been trying to write it. And it's been enormously difficult because it's been the most difficult thing to write, not only this, but the whole of my project, because it, you know, like you're doing a project about the environment or about, what's the subject? Yes, sustainable development. This, which is probably in Sweden, Swedish policy, perhaps European policy, this covers continents, it covers 6 languages, it covers history of the 20th century, not only European history, but the history in every single country, and it covers what being Jewish was in all these countries. So it's an incredibly difficult, and then I'm trying to write it so that anybody would want to read it. Mm-hmm. So it's been very difficult, and so I think sometimes these pictures convey so much more than the written word. I don't know if this makes sense to you. Then this is the thing that we use pictures for as autobiography. How many of you have had to put pictures on websites, on if you're going to speak somewhere, they want a picture of you. This was pictures taken in Sweden, and one year I was one of the top 5 researchers for some reason in the university. So I had this picture taken, and we had a huge, the one with the sunflowers, and we had a huge debate about how I would represent myself. And and the amount of work that went into that picture, and it's slightly askew. I had to have some kind of papers because that was me as an academic, but I didn't want to look like an academic. I didn't want to look old, and I wanted, So all of those so in this kind of very simple photograph, there was a huge amount of debate, and I think a lot of where we do choose the photographs that we choose to show ourselves, we equally, they're never, the first one we take, they're always very carefully tailored. And this was another one, similar kind of photograph. And that's Sweden, of course, that's the campus. In the spring, in the summer. Not now.
It's my window view.
Now this is another pictures as biography. This is my subject, Harriet Martineau, and she was highly controversial in her time in the 19th century because she was a feminist and she was a scholar, and she wrote about things like birth control, and she wrote about women's issues, and she wrote about economics, and she wrote about history, and she was on the, if you like, the more progressive side of British politics, and I think these are interesting because they're both these originated in the same year when she's 31, and this one is a kind of ordinary photo, kind of ordinary picture that's not photograph of her, a kind of very conventional picture of a young woman. But this is another portrayal, which was a caricature, what we call a caricature, and it was in Fraser's Magazine, which was a very important political journal. And it's very interesting how she's portrayed. A spinster with a cat, which is associated with witches, and almost like a cauldron here, a fire. So there's a kind of image of a witch, and she's toasting. I think she's got teacups and she's cooking by the fire. But it was accompanied by a very, very critical article about her and about what right did she have to speak for things to talk about? What right did a woman have to talk about birth control? How she was an egoist. She was an unwomanly woman because she was talking about subjects that women shouldn't talk about. So I think this is very interesting because it's the same year, 1833. And these are the new autobiographical forms. And I've captured them from me again. And look how, and a number of people have talked about this during these couple of weeks, look how we inscribe ourselves in our everyday communications. One is Twitter and one is Facebook. I'm sorry they're not very clear because I took the picture. I didn't know how to, I took the, picture. But here I describe, very carefully who I am. You have to do 5 or 6 words or 10 words or something. And that same photograph. Do you think I look like that photograph? But I liked it. I took it about 3 years ago. But do you think I look like that? Do you think it's all right? It's not too dishonest. But and of course we've all talked now. We've been talking today about how many of you are on Facebook. And isn't it interesting how people inscribe their lives so differently on Facebook? Some people are perpetually on holiday. Some people talk about illnesses. We have one colleague that tells us step for step when she's in hospital what's happening to her. We have other people that we share who just take photographs of the food they eat. And I have to say, I do mainly political stuff because I'm quite active politically. But there are 2 personal things I did recently. My daughter got married, and I put a picture up of her because I thought it looked so sweet. And then I was on Etna in Sicily recently, and it wasn't boasting about being on holiday, because I hate that. But it was just a wonderful landscape. It was like being on the moon, and I tried to show people that. So how we present ourselves on photographs and in these new forms of media is very interesting, and we're learning about it all the time, and we learn things about people we never knew about. We learn about what kind of side they want to present to the world, about what kind of person they want to present to the world. And I think my generation, us vintage people, as Valerie said, quite a lot of us are scared of this kind of. We've spent all our lives hiding ourselves away from people. The last thing we want to do is expose ourselves. But I think younger generations have learned how to do it mainly without damaging themselves. Not getting much. And I like this. This is how we tend to see a life. And such a lot of biographies and autobiographies are built in this way. And I think they're built in this way because we love them. And we were talking in our group about how to write a narrative. Can you write a narrative of a project? Does what is expected of us when writing a PhD, does it allow us to use a narrative form? And we had a big debate. I don't think it does. Because narrative tends to be descriptive, and we're supposed to be very analytic in our work doing a PhD. This is something that this is the wheel of life, and I think it's quite an amusing portrayal. I think I'm about, where am I about? Here. But of course it's male. So, I'm going to get to the activity bit, but I'll get to the activity bit in a minute. So what does autobiography offer to research? And one of the reasons I'm talking about this in this way is because when I read when I read articles that people have sent in to journals, or when I read a thesis, I think often we think that what we are seeing in our subject or an interviewee is the truth. And it's often portrayed like this. This is what they said. We group it all together, and this is the truth. So, what does autobiography offer us research? Is it the truth? a truth, retrospective and therefore perhaps unreliable. I mean, I've been asked to, people have come to interview me about my life because they're doing project, I'm sure that's happened to a number of us here, they're doing something on women in higher education or something like that. And the story I tell differs from if I've got up in the morning and I've had a good night's sleep and I haven't got up, or I've struggled to get into work in the morning. I would tell a different kind of story. So when we talk about when we reflect, when we're asked to look back at our life and the causes, the reasons why we got to particular places, what validity has that kind of account? How true is it? How does it match what actually happened? And we all know the story, don't we, of 3 witnesses at an accident, maybe the elderly Jewish accident, the guy fell over. And they'll all have different views, they'll all have different understandings of what happened, because we see it from our perspective. Is it a conscious selection from experience? So do our interviewees, how do they shape what they're going to tell you? Us? Does it just come out? Do they think first? Do they prepare first? Do they think carefully what they're going to say first? One of the things I like about autobiography is it creates a unified subject. It brings together, as I've said to you, it brings together in a body all sorts of events and perspectives into one body, and therefore I think that's why we like it so much, because we can understand it. And Louise's I really worried about coming after Louise because it's such a tour de force, but her picture of your massive picture of the knowledge economy is quite difficult. I mean, some of us had to sit there afterwards and think, well, what do we think about them? Whereas bodies, people are readable, we found we're more comfortable with that. And to what extent is autobiography truth or fiction? I mentioned to you that I'm talking about, again, your people you're interviewing. I talked to you about Alan Bennett, the writer who wrote about his mother and how she looked mad because they'd washed her hair in the hospital. And he writes that story again in fiction. And of course, people who write fiction have to draw on something, and they usually draw on their own autobiographies of their own lives. So, to what extent is what the people you're interviewing, teachers saying to you, what is it that they're telling you? And I said, for me, this is the most important aspect. Have you got any other? Has anybody got any other ideas about it? Do you think it offers? I'm not getting feedback now. Warmth. Yes.
I sometimes think I think sometimes people write autobiographies to settle scores.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Manchester United fan, and apparently Alex Ferguson's biography is full of score settling and putting people in their place and telling, locker room stories.
So it's an act of vengeance.
Yes. I think we underestimate the power of vengeance in narrative.
You know something? I found a letter. I'm telling you personal stuff. How are we doing on time? I'm nearly there. I found a letter that my mother had written to my prospective husband about the fact that that they weren't married. And she decided to tell him before we got married, just in case he might have some objections, right? But she swore him to secrecy, so he never told me. I always assumed that they had been married and that he'd been thrown out, that kind of thing. I didn't know he had a family somewhere else. I didn't, any of that. So I found this, my ex-husband had this letter, and he told me about it. I didn't know of its existence. He told me about it 40 years later. And I took it, analysed it, and presented it as a paper. And somebody said to me, was this an act of vengeance? Was this an act, because my mother, the thing she didn't want was anybody to know of my illegitimacy. And she didn't even tell me, because it was in the 1950s, it was a terrible, it was a, you know, she was suffered for it herself in her own life. She was immensely respectable. She looked very respectable, you know. And so they said, was my act an act of vengeance? And I was very, because I've made it public. It's now published, actually. And I think it was. I felt very angry. Even after all these years, I felt very angry that I hadn't been told. And so I think it was an act of vengeance. So that's exactly what you're saying. Okay. Now, I'm summarising this, and this is what I want you to work on. These are the issues I think are involved in this kind of work. There's identity, and it's multiple and fluid and constructed. Look at the way we present ourselves in different ways to different people. We present ourselves on Facebook, we present ourselves here, we present ourselves in other settings. So identity, because it involves bodies and lives, is very important. Time is very important because when you are talking, when you are narrating, you are looking back, but it's often for the future. It's done in the present, you're looking back, but it's for future. It's for how the future will judge you. Methodology. I've talked to you about how to do this. The quality of evidence, validity, reliability, rigour. How you collect your data is important. And as I've said to you, and there's been a huge amount of work on memory as well, and we now know that memory is fallible, and there's concepts of false memory. So when we ask, what is your experience of? What's your experience of? People, what they remember is very selective. And what memory researchers have shown is that we work on our memories so that we have a memory at some time, and sometimes that's triggered off by photographs, which we think is a memory. And so we work that memory, and we work that memory, and that becomes a changed memory over time. But we don't. So memory isn't just there, it's worked on by us. So what do we do with memory? Is that important? How do we treat people's accounts of the past? And then then it's research. And their impact on in the writing of the life, in the representation of the life, in their reflexivity on what they've done, because I've been quite open about the kind of lives that I'm trying to write and the reasons why I'm writing it. Many people don't do that. And if you read biographies and autobiographies, they rarely talk about the process of collecting and doing. And ethics around, as you say, vengeance, scores, accuracy, lies, and so forth. And I want you in a minute to, I'm come to the last bit, so I just want to do this, and I'm going to go back to the other thing. So when you write, these are the questions that I would ask you when you're doing your work on people's experience, their life. What do you emphasise? Do you emphasise the thing you've wanted to say all along? Is that, the purpose of your research is to, and this is what you want to emphasise? What do you leave out? And one of the questions I have of people who do these huge qualitative data sets, they collect masses of data, and then they select themes. What do they do with the rest of the data? Doesn't that count? Why has that been rejected? Why hasn't that been used? Isn't that valid? What, you know, and we, all of us who do qualitative research, reject a lot of, we don't use all our data. And I've often thought that's very dishonest as qualitative researchers. And one of the things I've been very interested in recent years, and I've asked people, is when you select a theme, why do you select that theme? Why do you, how do you select a theme and reject another theme? Do we do it because it conforms with what we want to find? I suspect it does. So there's a lot of ethics around what we leave out. How you shape the story, how you tell it, and this is what you're going to do in your thesis. What voice do you use? And this is where I probably will disagree with Valerie about some of the writing around theory. I've had enormous debates with Patty Lather and people like that about writing. And I had a debate, it came out of early feminism, where we felt we should write simply so that we should make our ideas accessible. Right? So I've always had a view of writing that it should be accessible, but often people then prefer a very complex text because they feel they want to work on it and they can struggle with it and they can take positions up. So there are different ways of thinking about writing. So what kind of voice do you use? What form of evidence do you draw on? What ethics are involved? And finally, and I think this is the damage. This is the damaging thing. If you're trying to write a life, is the message, because often it's your message, it's not the life's message. So that just to say that I've written a book with somebody else called Deconstructing and Reconstructing Lives. And unfortunately, it's with a Canadian publisher, University Press, and it's quite difficult to get. So I'm offering it here if some people want it. So that's why I bought some. But what I want you to do now I want some questions, please. Thank you.
Gaby, could I suggest we do a Sussex bus to Jennifer?
All right, yes, Sussex bus.
That'd be a good idea.
Yes, thank you.
And then come back
Yes.
together at the new point.
Yes, I do, yes.
We'll do the activity.